Kermanshah was already being strangled before the obituary arrived. Outside the city, the roads leading into tunnels beneath the mountain were pockmarked with craters, which means this war had already moved past hitting dots on a map and into closing the exits of a live missile belt. And once that happens, the next targets are not just launchers. The next targets are the men who know when those launchers come out. And then came the kill claim that changes the whole picture. Israel's military spokesman says the officer eliminated in Kermanshah was responsible for many missile launches at Israel, which means this was presented not as a prestige hit, but as the removal of a man tied to recurring fire, not a face, a function, not symbolism, output. And this is where the title cashes in. Independent war tracking says strikes on missile unit commanders such as Azimi likely explain, in part, why Iran has struggled to conduct large-scale missile barrages at Israel. So this is not just another dead commander story. This is a story about whether another launch brain just disappeared while the war still needs men like him to keep the barrages alive. If you're the kind of viewer who wants the part of the war governments can say out loud, subscribe now and drop one word in the comments, broken or buried, because that's the real argument tonight. Is Iran's missile threat actually breaking, or is it just going deeper underground? Kermanshah keeps appearing because it is not scenery. The area has been repeatedly targeted because it is home to multiple missile bases and radar equipment, which makes it one of those places where detection, coordination, storage, and launch discipline are packed into the same geography. That means if a missile unit commander was really removed here, the strike landed exactly where a barrage war is supposed to be organized. That matters because people hear the word chief and think rank. Rank is not the interesting part. The interesting part is whether this man belonged to the layer that turns hidden capability into timed salvos. The layer that decides which launcher moves, which route opens, which crew risks exposure, and whether another night of sirens gets built on schedule. That is why the title says Barrage Master, not Missile Officer. A barrage is not a warehouse. A barrage is choreography under surveillance. It is movement, sequencing, timing, communications, and nerve. And once the war enters that phase, the people who can still conduct the rhythm become more valuable than the hardware sitting in the dark. The Israeli military's English version names him as Makram Adami and calls him the commander of a central missile unit in western Iran. The title is doing heavy work there. Central means he was not being sold as a local nobody. Caught in the blast, he was being framed as a live node inside the Western firing architecture. And once you hear it that way, another becomes the most important word in the title. Another means pattern. Another means the strike was meant to be read as one more removal from a thinning chain. Another means viewers are not clicking for one dramatic death. They are clicking to know whether the people who still know how to run Iran's barrage machine are being taken off the board one by one. That is why a kill like this hits harder in mid-war than it would at the opening. Early in a conflict, large stockpiles and rehearsed plans can carry momentum. Mid-war is different. Mid-war is when surviving hardware starts, depending on surviving competence. The force still armed is not automatically. The force still coherent. The Israeli case goes further and says this commander oversaw dozens of ballistic missile launches toward Israel. If that is true, then his value was measured in repetition. He was not important because he wore the right insignia. He was important because he had already helped convert Western Iranian infrastructure into actual incoming fire over and over again. That is the version of the story the audience came for. And it is the right version. Not a senior figure died, not another strike was reported. The real story is whether the men who make barrages possible are being identified and removed faster than they can be replaced. Because if that is what is happening, the damage is deeper than another explosion. It is procedural, it is institutional, it is contagious. A missile force can survive losing metal. It survives less easily when it starts losing memory. Memory of routes, memory of launch windows, memory of which units still work, which decoys still fool, which patterns keep crews alive, which command chain still answers in time. Lose enough of that, and the arsenal begins to outlive the practical knowledge needed to use it well. The wider assessment makes the danger even clearer. It repeats the Kermanshah commander claim and adds that several battalion commanders in the same unit were also tied to dozens of launches at Israel. That is not just one head removed from the top. That is vertical damage running down the launch chain from the commander level into the battalion layer. That actually helps translate orders into fire. And that is exactly what the title promised. Not just a death, but a loss to Iran's barrage-making capacity in the middle of an active war. If the battalion layer is being cut as well, then the damage is not ceremonial. It is operational. It means the chain is being attacked where it repeats, where it scales, where it turns one night of missiles into the next. Now the strike starts looking less like drama and more like method. Crater the tunnel approaches, pressure the launch zone, remove the commander. Remove battalion-level men beneath him. Then wait and see whether the next barrage comes thinner, later, smaller, or more desperate. That is not random violence. That is an attempt to teach the missile force to fear its own launch process. The broader launch pattern already points in that direction. There was a pronounced decline in launches after the first few days, which means the war's opening rhythm did not hold. That does not prove one strike in Kermanshah changed everything by itself, but it does support the bigger idea that something inside Iran's ability to sustain mass fire has been under pressure for a while. And this is where sloppy analysis ruins good war reading. Fewer launches do not automatically mean fewer missiles. They can mean fewer safe windows, fewer reliable routes, fewer commanders trusted to expose launchers, fewer crews confident that surfacing for a barrage will not turn them into target practice within minutes. That middle layer is where most reporting gets boring because it turns into charts and jargon. But for YouTube, for real viewers, for people who click because they feel something changed, this is the live nerve of the story. The question is not whether mountains still hide missiles. The question is whether the force still knows how to make those mountains dangerous on command. One of the clearest explanations is also the least glamorous. Destroyed headquarters and degraded command, control, and communication may have left operational and tactical units making decisions without guidance from higher echelons. That is what breakdown really looks like in a missile war. Not silence, not surrender, a still-armed force that increasingly struggles to behave like a single, disciplined system. Once that starts, every surviving competent operator becomes more valuable than the missiles themselves, because the thinner the chain gets, the more each remaining node carries. One more missing commander does not just subtract a body. It multiplies hesitation. It widens uncertainty. It forces more decisions downward and laterally into a structure already fighting from cover and under stress. That is why mid-war kills matter differently. Early war hype is about shock. Mid-war kills are about stamina. Can the force still coordinate? Can it still time? Can it still trust its own routes and command loop enough to risk a real barrage instead of smaller, safer, more scattered fire? That is the battlefield underneath the battlefield, and Kermanshah sits right inside it. Another wire version of the claim says the killings further degraded Iran's ballistic missile unit while missile infrastructure in western and central Iran is being dismantled. Read that carefully and the picture sharpens fast. This is not being sold as one isolated success. It is being sold as a coordinated effort to break a launch ecosystem in the very geography that feeds the Western missile belt. That framing matters even if you distrust official triumphalism, and you should, because governments lie loudest when the truth is mixed. One side wants the world to hear collapse. The other side wants the world to hear resilience. The truth is usually nastier than both. The force may still be dangerous while becoming less coherent, less confident, and less capable of generating the same kind of pressure it once could. That is why the title works on people. It does not ask whether Iran still has missiles. Almost everyone assumes it does. It asks whether Iran has lost another man who mattered to the act of firing them. Well, that is a much darker question, because it forces you to think about warfare as a human network first and a weapons inventory second. And this is exactly why cheap victory talk should make you suspicious. Even close to the 1-month mark, U.S. intelligence could only determine with certainty that about a third of Iran's vast missile arsenal had been destroyed. So the clean fantasy that the missile threat is basically gone does not survive the harder intelligence picture. Too much remains hidden, uncertain, damaged, buried, or potentially recoverable. That fact does not weaken the Kermanshah story, it makes it more important. If the arsenal is not simply gone, then the war has to be fought at the level of usability. Who can still access it? Who can still coordinate it? Who can still risk turning survival into action? In that kind of war, the death of one barrage operator can matter more than another dramatic crater in another empty compound. And that is the brutal logic of another barrage master. You say another when you understand the war is no longer just about destroying tools. It is about exhausting the shrinking pool of people who can still use those tools with discipline under relentless pressure. Once the war enters that phase, replacement is not instant. Replacement is dangerous, rushed, and often worse than the original. Another intelligence assessment makes the contradiction even harsher. Roughly half of Iran's missile launchers were still believed to be intact, and thousands of one-way attack drones remained in the arsenal despite weeks of strikes. So no, this is not a story about an enemy that cannot still inflict pain. It is a story about an enemy that may still be armed while becoming less able to convert surviving hardware into sustained, coordinated barrages. That is the trap officials exploit. One side points to surviving launchers and says the war machine lives. The other points to reduced launch rates and says the war machine is collapsing. But both can be true at once. A force can keep dangerous assets underground and still be losing the men, the routes, the sequencing, and the nerve needed to use them at scale. And the deeper underground the surviving force goes, the more the human layer matters. A launcher in a tunnel is not the decisive thing by itself. The decisive thing is the officer who knows whether that launcher can be surfaced tonight, from which exit, with which escort, after which decoy, under which radar conditions, and with what chance of surviving the return hunt. That is why losing another barrage master hits harder than losing another truck. Tehran's public line early in the war was to say a few commanders may have been lost, but that this was not such a big problem. And that sentence was not confidence. It was damage control. It was the state telling its own side that decapitation does not equal confusion, that leaders are replaceable, and that the chain still knows how to function no matter how many faces vanish from it. But that line hides fear inside it. Governments only downplay losses that aggressively when they understand the thing being hit really could matter. And live research did not surface a public Iranian confirmation of this specific Kermanshah kill, which makes the silence itself part of the fight. Confirm it, and you validate penetration. Deny it too hard, and you risk looking weak later. So ambiguity becomes the safest mask. That silence is where the story turns ugly, because the worst possibility for Tehran is not just that a commander died, it is that the people who know how to keep the missile belt functional are being found faster than they can be replaced. If that is true, then what is disappearing is not just manpower. It is trust, rhythm, institutional memory, and the confidence required to launch big without dying bigger. And once fear enters the launch cycle, it changes everything. Crews wait longer. Commanders hedge more. Routes get used less. Salvos get smaller. Valuable systems stay buried because survival starts. Competing with retaliation inside every decision. That is how a missile force can remain dangerous while quietly becoming less decisive. The wider war makes that pressure even more volatile. Elsewhere in the campaign, expert video analysis tied a Tomahawk strike to a military base beside a primary school in southern Iran, where Iranian authorities said 168 people, including around 110 children, were killed. That matters here because every strike on a military node now carries a second war inside it. Not just whether the target was valuable, but whether the human cost feeds the other side's determination to keep fighting through degradation. So this is not a clean intelligence thriller where one perfect strike solves a puzzle. It is a brutal exchange between operational gain and strategic blowback, between weakening a missile network and feeding the fury that justifies preserving what remains of it. That is why serious scripts cannot sound like press briefings. Every claimed success in this war drags a darker cost behind it. But that cost does not erase the operational meaning of Kermanshah, it sharpens it. Because if a state is still willing to push strikes into a radar and missile belt, that exposed, then it is telling you what it thinks the war is really about. Not just burning inventory, breaking the ability to keep generating barrages that shape tempo, fear, and political pressure across the theater. So let's answer the title without flinching. Did Iran lose another barrage master mid-war? If the Kermanshah commander was really eliminated, then yes, not because he was glamorous, but because he belonged to the layer where hidden inventory becomes repeated fire, and if that layer keeps getting hit, the missile machine can stay armed while becoming less coordinated, less confident, and less able to deliver pressure in the same heavy rhythm. And if the claim was inflated, partial, or rushed, the deeper conclusion still survives. Israel chose to frame this strike around a barrage operator because that is the vulnerability it wants both Tehran and the world to see. Not that every missile is gone, but that the men who know how to use the surviving ones are becoming the real battlefield. You do not sell the war that way unless you believe that is where it is being won or lost. That is why those cratered roads beneath the mountain are the perfect symbol of this whole phase. The missiles may still be underground, the launchers may still be intact in frightening numbers. But if the exits are scarred, the commanders are dying, the battalion layer is thinning, and the communications chain is fraying, then the threat starts shrinking from the inside long before it disappears from the map. So the hardest word in the title is not eliminated. It is loses. Because losing a barrage master does not just mean losing a man. It means losing timing, losing confidence, losing usable memory, losing the practical intelligence that turns a buried weapon into a coordinated night of fire and in the middle of a missile war. That kind of loss can matter more than an arsenal still sleeping in the dark. Stay subscribed, because this channel follows wars past the explosions and into the hidden mechanics that decide who still has real power when the headlines stop making sense.